David sat at the dinner table, pushing his food around on his plate without really looking at it. Emily, sitting across from him, seemed to notice but said nothing. The usual warmth between them had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence that neither of them dared to acknowledge. He had been feeling it for a while now. The distance, the coldness in Emily's gaze, the way her eyes would often drift away from him when he spoke, as if she were somewhere else, someone else. His mind wandered back to their wedding day. The smiles, the promises, the unspoken understanding that their love was solid. But now here they were, two people living in the same house but feeling miles apart. Every word between them felt like it was carefully measured, carefully avoided, as though each one might expose something neither of them was ready to face. "You've been working late a lot," David said, his voice betraying the unease that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Emily didn't look up from her plate, her fork hovering just above the food, as if she were waiting for it to speak to her. "It's been a busy few weeks, that's all," she replied casually, the words coming out too quickly, too practiced. David nodded, but something in her tone made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was a hint of defensiveness there, or maybe it was just guilt. He couldn't be sure. His instincts told him something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He hadn't wanted to believe it at first. He had trusted Emily completely. She was the woman he married, the mother of their children, the person who had shared his life for so long. But the more time passed, the more David felt like there was a shadow between them, a shadow that he couldn't escape, a shadow he had ignored until it had started to stretch and cover everything. "Are you sure that's all it is?" he asked, his voice low. He regretted the question the moment it left his lips. Emily's eyes finally met his. There was something in her gaze that made David's heart skip a beat, a fleeting moment of vulnerability that disappeared almost as soon as it appeared. "Yes, David," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just work." He wanted to believe her. He did believe her in that moment. But the nagging doubt, the sinking feeling in his gut, wouldn't go away. It was like a drip, drip, drip of water slowly wearing away at the foundation of their marriage. David excused himself from the table, needing air, needing to clear his head. As he stood up, Emily didn't try to stop him. That was the part that hurt the most. He wasn't sure when they had stopped caring enough to fight, to argue, to fight for each other. Outside, the cool evening air hit him like a slap to the face. He leaned against the railing of their balcony, staring out at the city below. The lights twinkled, a cold reminder of everything he had worked so hard to build. But none of it seemed to matter now, not without Emily. His phone buzzed in his pocket and he fished it out, distracted. It was a message from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it. The message was brief. "Is everything set for tonight? See you soon." His heart skipped a beat. He stared at the screen, the words swimming in front of him as if they were somehow written in a foreign language. The message was from Emily's phone, but the sender wasn't listed. David's mind raced and his heart pounded in his chest. It was as if the entire world had frozen around him. He replayed the conversation at dinner, the defensiveness, the avoidance, the nagging sense that something was off. His hands trembled as he read the message again. It wasn't just his imagination. Something was wrong. David's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. David sat in his car, the engine running but his mind elsewhere. His phone buzzed incessantly in his hand, each vibration pulling him back from the dark abyss of his thoughts. He didn't want to know the truth, but he had no choice. The message from the unknown number haunted him like a shadow he couldn't escape. "Is everything set for tonight? See you soon." The words echoed in his head, a chilling confirmation of his worst fear. Emily was having an affair, and Gregory was the one who had taken her. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to drive back home. Not yet. Not until he knew for sure. The need for answers pushed him forward, and with a steadying breath, David turned the key in the ignition and drove. It didn't take long for the investigator's report to come in. A long day of waiting had tested his patience, and now the evidence was finally in his hands. The report was thick with photographs, text messages, and location data. Each page made his stomach churn, and with every detail his gut twisted in a way that no man should ever experience. Confirmed, "Emily and Gregory Hamilton have been seeing each other for months," read the first line of the investigator's notes. David gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He skimmed through the photos. Emily and Gregory at expensive hotels, at quiet dinners, in places David had never even known existed. Each image was like a slap to his face. He felt his breath quicken, his pulse racing. His life, the life he'd built with Emily, felt like it was crumbling piece by piece before his eyes. The photographs weren't just images of a couple sneaking around. They were proof of a betrayal, an intimate act that no one should have to see. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was physical. His stomach turned violently, and a wave of nausea overtook him. He wanted to throw up, he wanted to scream, but above all, he wanted to understand. How had he missed it? How had Emily hidden this from him for so long? The investigator had also unearthed something even more sinister. Gregory wasn't just an affair partner. He was a predator. The investigator uncovered texts where Gregory threatened Emily, coercing her into continuing the affair under the guise of career threats. David's stomach churned further. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Emily had been trapped. David felt a mix of fury and sorrow, but the sorrow didn't last long. The anger rose faster than he could process. He'd been betrayed, yes, but he also knew one thing for sure. Gregory Hamilton wasn't going to get away with it. David's breath came in shallow gasps as he pulled up to his apartment building. The car stopped, but he didn't move. His hands clenched the steering wheel as the weight of the situation settled over him. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, his entire body trembling with the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The only thing he knew was that he needed answers, and he was done waiting. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked towards the door. But then something inside him hesitated. He thought of Emily. He thought of their children. How would they survive this? How would he survive it? His mind raced with the consequences of confronting her. Would it help? Would it destroy her? Would it destroy him? Inside the apartment, Emily was just finishing up some work. She looked up from her laptop when David walked in, her eyes wary but unreadable. The tension in the room was thick, heavier than anything he had ever felt between them. "David," she said quietly, her voice cautious. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the report on the table, his eyes burning with unshed anger and pain. "I know, Emily," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Her face turned pale, her hand freezing in mid-motion as she tried to lift her coffee cup to her lips. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. David felt the raw ache in his chest. He could see the guilt in her eyes. It was like a shadow clinging to her, refusing to let go. He had seen that look before, but now it was different. It was a look of someone trapped, caught in a lie so big that even the truth couldn't save them. The silence between them stretched out, suffocating. He didn't have to say anything more. The report, the photographs, the evidence, all of it spoke for itself. But Emily couldn't escape the truth any longer. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was breaking, and David could see it. The pain in her eyes mirrored his own, but it didn't soften the reality. She had betrayed him. David's voice cracked as he finally spoke. "Gregory?" His question was cold, sharp, cutting through the suffocating silence like a blade. Emily's face turned even paler, and her eyes filled with tears. "David, She stopped herself, her words lost in the weight of everything they both knew. David shook his head, the heartbreak in his chest threatening to suffocate him. "No, don't say it," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything." The betrayal was so deep, so final, that words didn't matter anymore. Emily stood frozen, unable to meet his gaze, as he turned away from her and walked out of the room. David couldn't escape the weight of Emily's silence. He had walked out of the room moments ago, needing to get away from the suffocating air between them. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. He had to do something, but he didn't know what. The anger, the pain, the betrayal, it was all tangled together in his chest, a knot too tight to undo. His eyes stared blankly at the wall of their bedroom. The space that once felt like home now felt foreign, alien. It was as if their entire life together had been a lie. David ran his hands through his hair, pacing back and forth, his mind spiraling. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his breath shallow. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Emily. The text simply read, "We need to talk." David's stomach twisted. Talk? What was there to talk about? The truth was laid bare, and no words could fix it now. Yet his fingers hovered over the screen. He stared at the message for what felt like an eternity. The door creaked open behind him. Emily stood there, hesitant, her eyes swollen from crying. She took a step forward, then stopped, as if waiting for permission. David didn't look at her. He couldn't. If he looked at her, the dam would break. The flood of emotions, the betrayal, the hurt, the rage, would consume him. "You said you wanted to talk," David finally said, his voice barely a whisper. It sounded foreign, like he was hearing someone else speak. Emily's voice trembled as she took a step closer. "David, please, I need you to understand." David laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Understand? You want me to understand? How could I possibly understand?" His words came out sharper than he intended, and he immediately regretted it. But the anger, the rage, was a force he couldn't control. "You slept with him, Emily. Him!" His words stung more than he thought possible. Every syllable burned like acid in his mouth. "I never wanted this," Emily whispered, taking another step forward. "It wasn't just about him. It wasn't about that. It was about me. I lost myself, David. I was lonely. I felt invisible." Her voice cracked as she spoke the last part, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. David shook his head, disbelief flooding his chest. "Lonely? You chose to be with him. Him, Emily, your boss, the one who used you, manipulated you. You didn't care about me or us. You just chose him." Tears ran down Emily's face as she stepped forward, reaching out a trembling hand. "David, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for this to happen." Her voice broke and she sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. "It wasn't him. It was me. I was broken. I thought I needed someone else to fill the emptiness, but I was wrong. So wrong." David's heart twisted painfully in his chest. He could see how broken she was, how torn up inside, but it didn't change the fact that she had destroyed everything they built together. He took a step back, his breath ragged. "And you think that just because you're sorry it'll fix everything? You think that's enough?" Emily's sobs intensified. "No, I don't expect it to be enough, David. I just need you to know that it was never about you. I love you. I never stopped loving you." The words, though soft and filled with regret, felt empty to David. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that somehow, somewhere in all the mess, there was a part of her that still cared. But he couldn't. He couldn't let himself. The pain was too raw, the hurt too deep. He stared at her, at the woman he once adored, and shook his head. "You don't get it. You betrayed me, Emily. You betrayed us." His words were harsh, but they were true. He could see the guilt in her eyes, but it wasn't enough to erase the truth of her actions. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, barely audible through her tears. "I just need you to know that I regret every second of it, and I'm so sorry." David swallowed hard, feeling like he was drowning in his own emotions. His eyes blurred, the anger slowly melting into something more painful. He looked at Emily for a long time, trying to process everything she had just said, trying to make sense of it. But it didn't make sense. None of it did. "Maybe I'll never forgive you," David said, his voice shaking with quiet devastation. "Maybe I'll never understand how you could do this to me, to us, but I need you to leave now. I can't do this." Emily's face crumpled as she heard his words. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She stared at him for a moment, her body shaking from the sobs she couldn't hold back. Finally, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the silence that swallowed the room. David didn't watch her leave. He stood there, frozen in place, as the weight of everything that had just happened crashed down on him. The tears burned in his eyes, but he couldn't bring himself to shed them. Not yet. David's hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel as he drove toward Gregory's office. The anger inside him had built up to a point where it was no longer something he could control. It was a storm waiting to break. His thoughts were a mess of rage, betrayal, and confusion. But one thing was clear. This moment had been inevitable. He had to confront Gregory. He had known about the affair for days now, but this was different. This was not just about Emily. This was about everything that had been destroyed, everything that had been taken from him. This was about power, Gregory's manipulation, Emily's betrayal, and David's own shattered heart. It was about time to make everything right. David arrived at the tall office building, the glass reflecting the city's skyline. He felt his heart race as he parked the car, each beat driving him closer to the confrontation he could no longer avoid. He stepped out, his body stiff with tension. His legs felt like lead as he walked through the revolving door, heading for the elevator. When the doors opened, Gregory was there, standing near the reception desk, wearing that smug smile David had come to despise. Gregory's eyes flickered as he saw David, his expression unreadable at first, then quickly replaced by one of indifference, almost as if he expected David to be here. "David," Gregory greeted, his voice smooth but laced with a hint of condescension. "I didn't expect to see you here. Is everything all right?" David didn't respond immediately. His eyes locked onto Gregory's, and for a moment the room felt like it was closing in on him. He had always admired this man in the past. Gregory had been a figure of success, charm, and influence, but now all he could see was a manipulative, calculating liar. "I know what you've been doing," David finally spat, his voice low but sharp. "You think you can just do whatever you want and get away with it?" Gregory's smile faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "David, this isn't what you think. You don't understand what's been going on between me and Emily." "No!" David snapped. "I understand perfectly. I've seen the texts, the pictures. I know what you've been doing to her, using her, controlling her. You don't give a damn about her. This was never about love, it was about power." Gregory stepped closer, his presence exuding confidence. "You think it's that simple? You don't know everything, David. Emily came to me for more than just physical comfort. She was looking for something you couldn't give her. I just helped her find it." David felt his blood boil. He had always been proud of his ability to keep his emotions in check. But this was different. This was personal. The words Gregory had just said made David feel like a fool, a puppet with no control. "You used her," David gritted out, his fists clenching so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You manipulated her, and for what? To feel like you're in control of someone's life? You think you're untouchable?" Gregory chuckled softly, a sharp, mocking laugh that only fueled David's fury. "I didn't make her do anything. She wanted it just as much as I did. She's not the innocent little wife you think she is, David. She was lost, and I gave her what she needed." The words hit David like a slap. He had always seen Emily as the woman he loved, the woman he married. But now, everything he knew about her felt like it was crumbling. He thought she was just lost, confused. But now, hearing Gregory's words, he started to wonder if he had ever really known her at all. "Don't you dare talk about her like that," David spat, his voice shaking with anger. "She was never yours to begin with. You think you can just walk away from this? You've ruined everything. You've ruined her." Gregory's eyes narrowed, and for the first time David saw a flicker of real emotion. But it wasn't regret. It was anger. "You don't know the first thing about her, David. She was just as much a part of this as I was. Don't make me the villain here." "I'm not making you anything," David replied, his voice cold. "You are the villain." In that moment, something inside David snapped. He had been holding it together for so long, but now, the flood of emotions, betrayal, sadness, and rage took over. He lunged at Gregory, but before he could reach him, a pair of security guards appeared, grabbing him by the arms and pulling him back. "Enough!" one of them shouted, his grip firm as David struggled to break free. Gregory stood off to the side, his face impassive, watching as David was restrained. David's chest heaved with exertion, but his mind was clear. He had lost control, but he didn't care. This moment, this confrontation, was the last straw. His whole world had been shattered, and there was no going back. The security guards held him firm, and for a moment, David simply stood there, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He didn't look at Gregory. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done. "Stay away from my family," David finally said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "If I see you near Emily again, I'll make sure you regret it." With that, David turned and walked away, the weight of everything finally sinking in. As he left the building, he knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He had no idea what he was going to do next. But one thing was clear. This fight wasn't over. David sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. His fingers tightened around the glass, but he couldn't bring himself to drink. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Maybe some kind of sign. Maybe for the world to make sense again. But it didn't. Nothing made sense anymore. He looked across the room, where the pictures of him and Emily used to hang. Their wedding photo, the one where they were laughing, so sure of the future. Now it felt like a lifetime ago. He didn't recognize the man in the picture anymore. Who was he? Who was the woman standing beside him? They were strangers to each other now. David had tried to reach out to Emily after the confrontation with Gregory. He had tried to understand. But the more he thought about it, the more disgusted he felt. He couldn't shake the image of her with Gregory, the way she had betrayed him, and yet part of him still longed for the woman she used to be. But what if that woman was gone? What if the person he thought he knew was nothing more than a mirage? The guilt twisted inside him. The anger. He had every right to feel what he felt, but it didn't make it easier. David had always been the rational one. He had always been the one who kept a cool head, who thought things through. But this was different. Nothing about this made sense. Nothing about this felt right. The phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Emily. "David, please, we need to talk." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd seen those words before, in a different context, and each time they had led to a conversation that chipped away at him further. What was there left to talk about? What could she possibly say that would make this any better? He tossed the phone back onto the bed. He wasn't ready to hear what she had to say. Not yet, but deep down, he knew he would have to face it. He couldn't keep running. He had spent the last few days in a haze, drinking more than he should have, trying to forget. But the truth was always there, lurking in the back of his mind, waiting for him to confront it. David rubbed his face, frustration mounting inside him. He hadn't slept more than a few hours in the last week. Every time he closed his eyes, all he saw was her with Gregory. It was an image that refused to leave. It was like a scar, one that kept reopening every time he thought he could move on. What did he even want? Revenge? Closure? He was angry at her, at Gregory, at the world for making him feel this way. But he couldn't deny the truth anymore. Emily had been the one to break the trust. Emily had been the one to destroy the foundation they had built together. The door creaked open, and Emily stepped inside, hesitating as if unsure of her welcome. Her eyes were red from crying, her face a mask of exhaustion and regret. David didn't move. He stayed seated, staring at the floor. She didn't need to say anything. The guilt was written all over her face. "I didn't want this, David," Emily's voice cracked as she spoke. "I never wanted to hurt you." David felt a pang of sadness in his chest, but it was quickly replaced by the anger that had been simmering inside him for days. He looked up at her, his expression cold. "Then why did you do it?" he asked, his voice raw, barely under control. "Why did you let it go this far?" Her lips trembled, and she took a step forward, her hands shaking. "I don't have an answer. I've asked myself that every day since. I don't know why I did it. I was weak. I let myself get lost, David." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "And I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The movement was so sudden it made Emily flinch. "Sorry," he said, his voice rising. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Emily. Sorry doesn't fix this. You broke everything." She stepped back, her eyes widening in fear, but David didn't care. He needed to say it. He needed to let it out. "You don't get to just say sorry and make it go away. Do you know how much this hurts? Do you know what you've done to me? To us?" "I know," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I've hurt you, and I wish I could take it all back." David's chest tightened. The words felt hollow coming from her. He didn't know what he expected from her, but this wasn't it. He had hoped for something, anything that would make him feel like maybe, just maybe, things could be repaired. But it wasn't there. The words she said couldn't take away the pain. He took a deep breath, his face hardening. "I can't do this, Emily. I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not. I can't trust you anymore, and I can't live like this." Her face fell, the despair in her eyes clear as she sank down onto the bed. She put her hands over her face, sobbing uncontrollably. David's heart twisted at the sight, but it didn't stop the anger from boiling inside him. She had broken his heart, and now, all she had left were her tears. David turned away from her, unable to watch her cry anymore. "I need space," he muttered, his voice rough. "I need to think. I can't do this right now." He walked out of the room, leaving Emily behind, alone with her regrets. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed felt like a deafening roar in his ears. David's hands trembled as he sat at the bar, staring into the glass of whiskey in front of him. The burn in his throat was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. He had tried to distract himself, to drown the pain, but it was futile. Every thought led back to her. Emily, the betrayal, the lies, the hollow apologies. He couldn't escape it. The messages, the photos, the way Emily had looked at him when she said she was sorry, but nothing changed. Nothing ever changed. The weeks that had passed since their last confrontation had only made things worse. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. And the worst part was, he didn't know if he even wanted it to be. David had tried to bury the anger, to push it down deep inside, but it kept resurfacing. There were times when he found himself staring at her, watching her go through the motions of their life together as if nothing had happened. But he couldn't ignore it any longer. It had shattered him. The sound of the door opening startled him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Emily. She always found him when he was like this, lost in his thoughts, too consumed with the weight of everything to do anything. "David," her voice was soft, tentative. "Can we talk?" He didn't answer right away. What could he say? She was the one who had destroyed everything, the one who had betrayed him in the worst possible way. He still remembered the way she looked at him when she confessed, her eyes full of guilt, her voice trembling as she tried to explain why it had happened. But nothing she said had made it better. He had tried to listen, to understand, but the pain was too great. The trust was gone. He couldn't get it back. David looked at her now, the woman he had once loved, the woman who had once been his whole world. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked as if she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was messy, and she was still wearing the same clothes from the night before. It was like she hadn't been able to bring herself to change. "Why, Emily?" David finally asked, his voice barely audible. "Why him? Why Gregory?" Emily closed her eyes, and David saw the tear that slipped down her cheek. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sat beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for the glass of wine in front of him. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know, David. I can't explain it. I was lost. And then Gregory—" She stopped herself, her face contorting with pain. David's eyes narrowed. "You were lost?" he repeated, his voice bitter. "You were lost, so you slept with him? You betrayed me, betrayed everything we had because you were lost." Emily flinched at the sharpness of his words, but she didn't look away. "I didn't mean to hurt you, David, I swear. I just felt like I was drowning, like I wasn't enough anymore. And he made me feel seen. He made me feel like I mattered." David's heart twisted. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the fact that she had felt unseen by him, that she had felt so lost in their marriage that she sought solace in someone else. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had failed her. He had failed them both. But the rage, the deep, searing anger, was still there. It had to be. He had to hold on to it. If he didn't, everything she had done, everything they had lost would be for nothing. "You chose him," David said through clenched teeth. "You chose him over everything we built, over me, over us." "I didn't mean for it to happen," she cried, her voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lose us." But David couldn't hear her anymore. The words had become hollow to him. She had already made her choice. He could see it now. He could see how much she had wanted this, how much she had been willing to sacrifice. And it made him sick to his stomach. "You've already lost me, Emily," David said, his voice cold, his eyes hard. "And I don't think there's anything you can say or do to change that." Emily recoiled as if he had struck her, her face crumpling with the weight of his words. She reached out for him, her hands desperate, trembling. "David, please, I love you. I need you." David stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back with a loud scrape. "You don't get to say that anymore," he said sharply. "You don't get to love me after everything you've done. You don't get to need me now that you've destroyed everything." He turned to leave, but as he reached the door he felt a sudden pang of guilt. For a brief moment he wanted to turn around, to take her in his arms and make everything okay again. But he couldn't. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the betrayal. "You've made your choice, Emily," he said one last time, his voice breaking despite his best efforts to remain strong. "And I've made mine." With that, David walked out, leaving her behind. The door clicked shut softly behind him, but the sound of it felt like the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. David's mind was numb. He couldn't remember how long he had been pacing in his apartment, but time had stopped mattering. The emptiness that had settled into his chest over the past few weeks was now an unrelenting void. His thoughts, like shards of glass, scattered in every direction, too jagged to piece together. He could still hear Emily's voice in his mind, pleading, crying for him to forgive her. But nothing she said changed the truth. She had shattered everything. She had destroyed him. It had been days since their last conversation, and each day had felt like an eternity. Emily had left him multiple messages, each one more desperate than the last. But David couldn't bring himself to respond. What was there to say? Every word she spoke felt like another blow to his already broken heart. The anger had settled into something darker, something that felt like a constant weight, a thick fog that he couldn't escape. David leaned against the kitchen counter, his hand gripping a glass of water that he didn't even want to drink. He couldn't focus. His mind kept circling back to the same questions. How did we get here? How could she betray me like this? He'd always been the one who kept their world steady, the one who held everything together. And now everything was in ruins. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Emily again. "I need to see you. Please." The message was brief, but the desperation in it was undeniable. He stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a surge of conflicting emotions. Guilt, rage, confusion. She had shattered his trust, and yet, part of him still cared. Part of him still wanted to believe her. But David knew better now. He had to face the truth, even if it tore him apart. There was no going back. After a long moment, he stood up, the glass of water left forgotten on the counter. His feet moved without thinking, carrying him toward the door. The urge to confront her was overwhelming. He couldn't live like this anymore, with everything left hanging in the air, unresolved. The anger was pushing him forward, but underneath it all was the raw, aching need for closure. Emily was waiting for him outside, standing by her car, her face a mirror of the guilt and fear that had consumed her for weeks. Her hair was pulled back loosely, her eyes red from crying. She looked so different from the woman he had once loved, the woman he thought he knew. "David?" Her voice trembled as she stepped toward him. "I'm so sorry. I know nothing I say can fix what I've done, but I need you to hear me out." David swallowed hard, the words on the tip of his tongue, but they didn't come. He was too tired, too broken to speak. All he could do was look at her, trying to find something, anything that would make this easier. "I never wanted this to happen," she continued, her voice shaking. "I was lost, and I made a terrible mistake. I never meant to hurt you, David. You were always my home." Her words didn't have the power they once did. The sincerity in her voice only deepened the ache in his chest, but the pain was a reminder of what she had taken. "You don't get to just say you were lost, Emily," David finally managed to say, his voice cold, his tone harsher than he meant. "You didn't just make a mistake. You chose him. You chose to betray everything we had." The sting of his words hit them both like a physical blow, but Emily didn't flinch. She stood there, her eyes locked on his, her expression pleading for understanding. "I was weak," she whispered. "I was so lost in myself, in my own loneliness, that I couldn't see the damage I was causing. But I can't undo it. I know I can't, but I need you to know that I never stopped loving you." David felt his chest tighten, but the words wouldn't come. How could she say that? After everything, after what she had done? He looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, his anger faltered, replaced by an overwhelming sense of sadness. "I can't forgive you," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. The finality of it hit both of them like a punch. He could see the flicker of hurt in her eyes, but he couldn't change it. He couldn't undo the damage. "I can't fix this, not anymore. You've broken me, Emily." She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached out for him. "Please, David, please don't do this. I'll do anything to make it right. Anything." David shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't what he wanted. He never wanted it to end like this, but it had already ended. And the truth was clear. She couldn't undo the pain, no matter how hard she tried, no matter how many tears she shed. "I've already made my choice," David said, his voice tight with emotion. "And you've made yours. I don't know what to do with this anymore." Emily stood there, silent, as if trying to process his words. The weight of what had been said hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Goodbye, Emily," David said, his voice barely audible, before turning and walking away. Each step felt like it was taking him further from her, from everything he had once hoped for. He didn't look back. David stood at the edge of the street, his eyes glazed with exhaustion. The world around him seemed to blur, the bright lights of the city stretching out like an endless void. His heart felt hollow, as if it had been carved out and left empty, exposed. The events of the past few weeks had taken everything from him, his trust, his love, his sense of self. And now, there was nothing left but the ache of a broken man, standing alone in the dark. His phone buzzed again, a message from Emily. He had stopped reading them days ago. Her pleas, her apologies, none of it mattered anymore. She had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. He had told her it was over, but a small, desperate part of him wanted to turn back, to find some way to fix it, to undo the damage, but he couldn't. David's footsteps felt heavy as he walked down the street, each one carrying him further from everything he once knew. His mind was a tangle of conflicting emotions: grief, rage, regret. The past few days had been a blur of sleepless nights and endless thoughts, none of them bringing him peace. He had tried to move on, but there was no escaping the wreckage of his life. As he walked past the familiar buildings, the places that had once been a part of his life with Emily, he felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The life they had built together was gone. It was all just a memory now, fading with each step he took. At that moment, the weight of the entire situation hit him with full force. He had tried to hold on, tried to fight through the pain, but the truth was undeniable. Emily had broken him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't piece the fragments back together. She had destroyed the foundation of their marriage, and no amount of apologies or regret could undo what had been done. The tears burned in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He couldn't. Not anymore. He had reached the point where even the tears felt like a betrayal. What was the point? What was the point of feeling anymore? David reached a small park at the end of the block. It was quiet, dark, the only sound the distant hum of the city. He sat down on one of the benches, burying his face in his hands. His chest tightened as the weight of everything crushed him. The anger, the sadness, the endless spiral of emotions. It was all too much. His thoughts kept returning to Emily, to the life they had once shared. But now, even her face felt like a stranger's. She wasn't the woman he had married, the woman who had stood beside him through everything. She was a different person now, a person who had destroyed everything they had built together. David reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone once again. He stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over her name. His thumb lingered over the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to call her. He couldn't go back to her, couldn't keep pretending that things could go back to the way they were. The damage was too deep. He couldn't fix it. And as much as it hurt, he knew he had to move on. He had to let her go. Let everything go. The sound of a distant siren broke through the silence of the night, and David looked up, his eyes dry, empty. He felt numb. Completely, utterly numb. Everything was a blur, a distant memory. Nothing mattered anymore. With a final glance at the city around him, he stood up, leaving the bench behind. The path ahead was uncertain, but he had no other choice but to keep moving. There was nothing left for him here. Not in this life, not in this broken marriage. And so he walked away. The finality of it hit him as he crossed the street, each step a small surrender to the reality of his broken life, the life he had known, gone. But in the silence of the night, one thing became painfully clear. This was his reality now. There was no turning back. What do you think of Emily's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. From 0 to 10, what's your score on this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And be sure to check out more heart-wrenching tales by clicking here on the end screen.